Thanks for coming today. The 2024 Cemetery Walk is focused on people who lie here who have served in the military during several of the conflicts that the USA has had experienced. And this is really one of our Historical Society's most popular programs, and this is the 20th annual walk this year, which I think is very exciting. And it wouldn't be possible without Mariam Hansen.
Yeah.
Every year, she organizes it, writes it, leads it, and just leaves no detail unturned. So that is dedication, and thank you, Mariam. And you'll hear about new lectures and other events in our monthly newsletter, which you'll get if you join the Historical Society. And we have membership forms at the desk that you can fill that out. Also at the Heritage Center is our museum, and the museum is open every Saturday, the first Saturday of every month from noon until 4. So stop by and just take a look at the self-guided. So just take a look through the museum and you'll see a lot of interesting things about the early settling of St. Helena and the immigrants who settled here. So, finally, on your way out, please stop over there at the ticket table to look at some of the local history books. And if you're interested in volunteering, there's a volunteer sign-up sheet, and there are lots of different things that you can do to help the Historical Society. And it's also a good thing to do. You'll meet new people, you'll learn new things, and really give back to our community. So I would like to turn it over to Shannon Coletto, who's going to give you a little background on today's tour.
All right. I'm going to give you a crash course in this poster, basically. All right. Can you hear me volume level? All right. All right, so I am Shannon Murray Coletto, and I served on the St. Helena Historical Society board almost 10 years, and I'm now on the Napa County Historical Society board. And I taught history in a past life at Georgia State University before I came to the Napa Valley. But in my 3 decades here, I have just really loved learning more about U.S. history through the lens of the local history. It really brings it home, brings it to life. And I also want to single out once again Mariam Hansen for her amazing work over 20 years. Helping with this one, I really realized how much work she's done over 20 years. And I also want to give a big bravo to the amazing drama students from St. Helena High School. They're freshmen. Many of them are in their very first performance publicly, and they've only had 4 weeks since school started to rehearse these things, and they have them memorized. I'm amazed. I couldn't do it. So this year, as Kathleen was saying, our 20th annual Cemetery Discovery Walk is, our focus is to connect our very local personal stories to the larger, grander sweep of the American history, especially military history, over 100 years, California's first century as a state. So all of the 2024 Spirits of St. Helena you'll meet today are veterans of various American wars, and our starting point is 1846, just before California became a state in 1850. Sorry, I have to teach. And it continues throughout the state's first century. And we will look through their eyes, these veterans' eyes, at history-making military events that not only shaped their individual lives, but also left a shared legacy that continues to echo through the decades. Through this lens, our spirits' stories and their interconnections that vividly bring to life America's history, California's history, and St. Helena's history from 1845 to 1945. And just to put that time frame in a certain perspective, using California's changing population, what do you think when you meet the pioneers at stops 1 and 2 in 1846? What do you think the California population was of white pioneers, of white Californios? 7,000. By a century later, when we get to the last stop in World War II, what do you think the population of California was? 10 million. From 7,000 to 10 million in 100 years, and now it's pushing 40 million, I believe. So much change in so short a time is mind-boggling. And though these days it's less common to acknowledge, wars have played a key role in causing and shaping all this change. Most of us could at least list these wars, especially the Civil War, World War I, World War II. But our knowledge might be pretty sketchy, pretty general. And one of the joys of local history is how it can personalize these epic sweeps and let us see how much more clearly what patriotism, what service, what sacrifice meant to those who served and to the small California community that they were a part of. Today you're going to meet spirits of St. Helena who served in the Civil War of the 1860s. Then we'll talk a little bit about the so-called Indian Wars that won the West, quote unquote. And then we'll see people from the Spanish-American War and the subsequent Philippine War at the turn of the 1900s. Then we'll visit some spirits who fought in the Great War, which we now know is World War I, but from their perspective, there was not a World War II yet to contrast that with. It was always called the Great War, and then World War II. But the war that kicks off our St. Helena-centric look at U.S. military history, where it all began for California about 4 years before statehood, is the Mexican-American War, which was fought between 1846 and 1847, and then was settled by a treaty in February of 1848 called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So the Mexican War, which is the way it was called then, not the Mexican-American War more formally, was perhaps the most foundationally consequential of all U.S. wars to Californians. But it's likely the one we least know about today. So we're going to take a little minute to talk about it. The mid-1800s, I think, are a fascinating period in American history, but it's an era that generally gets overlooked because it's overshadowed by the earth-shaking impact of the Civil War in the 1860s. So here's a few facts about the Mexican-American War that will really help you on the tour put both our spirit stories and California's history in better context. First, the Mexican War was terribly controversial, and it almost didn't happen. It was seen as a war of invasion, not defense, and America had never done that before, and many people thought it was downright immoral. You might be familiar with Thoreau's famous essay on civil disobedience. Well, he wrote that from jail because he had refused to pay his taxes because his taxes were going to be used to pay for the Mexican-American War. So it was a big anti-war stance that he was making. In 1844, just before this period, President Polk, candidate Polk, had run on a platform of manifest destiny. Most of you have heard that term, just this idea that it was America's God-given right to expand our borders all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Once he was in office, Polk had run on a platform. Once he was in office, he tried diplomacy to get the Mexicans to sell the lands of Alta California. You know, Alta California, you've probably heard this phrase, it's Upper California versus we still have Baja California. It was a district of the Mexican government, but it was basically the entire West, not just what we know as Upper California now. But the Mexicans were not interested in negotiating. And so when that failed, war was the only option for accomplishing the big goal. And in general, folks who wanted to expand slavery, like the Texans and like President Polk, they're the ones who were arguing for war because it was going to open up more territory to expand slavery. And second, so it was terribly controversial. And second, once our troops did cross the Rio Grande River in Texas, nearly all of Mexico War's battles were fought in Mexico proper. But a significant few were fought in what was then Mexico still, but is now Texas, New Mexico, and California. Did you know, for instance, that there was a battle called the Conquest of Los Angeles? You can learn more about that. Third, these battles of the Mexican War and their generals were hugely famous in their day. It's hard to underestimate that. It's Palo Alto, Buena Vista, Veracruz, Chapultepec, which was outside of Mexico City. And you've all heard sideways about Chapultepec if you've heard the Marines hymn. From the halls of Montezuma. That's what they're talking about. Was the big victory over Mexico City at Chapultepec. From all over the country, from upstate New York, all the way across the Midwest, there were new towns coming up as the population grew, and they named them after these battles, after these generals. Street names were named after these generals. San Francisco is full of street names that come named after men of this era. And we have in town, what do we have? Kearney and Stockton. Both are named after heroes of this war. Fourthly, there we go. Fourthly, newspaper war coverage became truly national for this war, and for the first time in U.S. history, it was reported straight from the field. It was a new style of news coverage altogether. And the newspapers, especially in the early months of the war, ginned up a lot of patriotic enthusiasm across the country. And this is the war where President Polk asked his home state of Tennessee for 3,000 volunteers, and 30,000 stepped up. And yes, that's why the UT football team is called the Volunteers. Facts you can use from history. But newspaper coverage cuts both ways, and as the war progressed, press reports of U.S. casualties or even atrocities being committed in Mexico resulted in increasing anti-war feeling, and more soldiers were dying of illness than from fighting. But luckily, it was short. And fifthly, the U.S. won the war after less than 2 years of fighting, and the treaty terms were amazing if you were in the U.S. What did the United States gain from Mexico? Vast territory. And I'm talking vast. This is what the word vast was invented for. Better than Polk could have dreamed of. Here's where California became an official U.S. district, plus Mexico ceded more than half of its whole territory to the United States. 55% of all of Mexico became America. That was their giant Alta California. It's the second largest continental. It's almost the same. If you count Texas, it's the same as Louisiana Purchase. But all of that's dwarfed by buying Alaska. But otherwise, I mean, this is huge. The future states, of course, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, big parts of Arizona, Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, and even Wyoming were in Alta California. The U.S. also won control of the West Coast ports of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego, which was kind of what they were going for. And that soon transformed the U.S. into a huge player in the China-Pacific trade, which was about to go crazy because California was firmly and legally in U.S. hands when gold was discovered. This alone put game-changing wealth in the U.S. economy for years to come. Some people even argue that California gold was essential to Union victory in the Civil War. Like whoever controlled the California gold was going to win. Sixthly, our last Mexican War note is that there was a California front to the Mexican-American War, and it got started early with a bit of local drama. About a month before news reached all the way around, and had to come by ship, before the news reached here, that Washington, D.C. had really declared war on Mexico, the new Napa Valley settlers made up 20 out of the 33 American-born men who jumped the gun on the Mexican-American War and staged their famous, or many people consider it infamous, Bear Flag Revolt. This is you may recognize the flag from the Bear, or one of the flags from the Bear Flag Revolt. Because we live in Northern California and have visited Sonoma, we've probably seen the statue on the plaza there, or we've heard about the Bear Flag Revolt. And believe me, there's so many stories about the Bear Flag Revolt, we should do an entire piece on this one in the future. The lucky, at least 5 of the Bear Flaggers are buried here, along with their wives and family, who certainly shared the risks of frontier rebellion. These men and their families were desperate to stay in California after being ordered to leave. In June of 1846, they made a life or death gamble to invade General Vallejo's Mexican command post in Sonoma, arrest and jail General Vallejo, declare the Republic of California, like Texas had done before them in the 1830s, and then hope against hope that the U.S. would soon appear and claim the territory. Lucky Bear Flaggers, their gamble paid off. No Mexican counterattacks ever came. They celebrated July 4th in behind their barricades in Sonoma, and under their makeshift bear flag. Turns out they only had to hold out about 3 weeks, because in July the U.S. Navy arrived on horseback, of course. And it was Paul Revere's grandson carrying the news that the Mexican War was on. California was claimed by the U.S. The Bear Flaggers dissolved their 3-week-old republic and raised the stars and stripes and joined the fight. And our last interesting connection here, as we stand here in the Helena Cemetery, we actually owe this cemetery to a Bear Flagger, William Pink Hudson. At our first stop, we're going to be speaking with his wife, Sarah Smith Hudson. She's the first person buried here on what was Hudson private land in 1856 when she died. This established this cemetery as the first was private, then became public cemetery in St. Helena, and it's now, since 2019, on the National Register of Historic Places. That's how important this cemetery is. It has national significance. So as we walk over to stop 1, let's get our minds back in Napa Valley of 1846, where the future was feeling very, 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 very uncertain. And the families that we'll be meeting, the Griffiths, the Hudsons, the Yorks. So if you'll follow Mariam to stop 1, we can hear more directly from the spirits.
It does my heart good to see so many folks visiting. Doesn't it remind you of our old days in Napa Valley when we gather on the grounds of Dr. Bale's burning gristmill?
Oh, how we cook, laugh, and do some praying. Talk about crops, but mostly we wanted to get our own pieces of land from the Mexican folks who ran things. See, we newcomers were American immigrants, and the Napa Valley is part of Mexico there. We were not welcomed here in 1845. General Vallejo over in Sonoma sent riders to the Napa Valley to invite us to get out in just 40 days. Lord.
But oh my stars, where are our manners? My name is Sarah Hudson, and this here's my sister-in-law, Lucinda Hudson York. I'm about 9 years older than Lucinda here. Back in Missouri, my loving husband, William Pink Hudson and I, well, we'd already had 3 babies by the time Lucinda here got married to her husband, Jack York. We call him Jack.
Oh, that takes me back, Sarah. That was just before all us Hudson, Yorks, and Griffiths decided to risk it all, leave Missouri, and head west in our wagons to the Oregon country. Turned into quite a train crossing the plains. Hardly anyone had done that yet in 45. Our leader, Mr. Crispy, and 250 of us decided in the Idaho country that we'd forget Oregon and bet on California instead.
And I recall, if there weren't hardship enough on those wagons, after jolting along all day, your train babies came.
That's just how we women folk did back then, Sarah. Jack York and I had 1 baby in Missouri. All the rest of my 11 children were born here in St. Helena. That Missouri baby was Dean. These folks might know the street names for him. Dean York Lane, over on our land at the foot of Spring Mountain.
Oh, us Hudsons and Yorks really put our mark on this town, that's for certain. Even in this here cemetery. When I passed in 1856, Ma William laid me to rest here. I was the very first. I was just 42 and left 7 children behind. Before long, Ma William let this town have his land back. It's a comfort having family all around.
Sarah, why don't you tell these folks about when you had your baby Molly, the one who married the McCormick boy and kept the big stock range up on Spring Mountain in the family so long?
Oh, Lucindy, that was a time. Back when you had your twins, beyond the Sierras, I found out I was a newlywed child. This was fall, 1845. We were crossing into California. Mr. Sutters on the Sacramento River was happy enough to see us, but made us anxious too. It was a bad time for Americans to settle here.
Well, sure. With so many of us coming at once, Mexican officers feared they'd lose the land, like they lost Texas a few years before. War talk was rumbling all over the country, and President Polk wanted an even bigger Texas, along with California and the whole Southwest.
And we were right to worry. As we soon saw, my belly grew with each week that passed in California, first in Sutters, then with Mr. Yount in Napa Valley, then in the cabins we built in early '46 up on Corcoran Canyon. It's called Calistoga now, and I hear Mr. Buster runs a restaurant up there, by our old cabins.
The men hunted and worked for Dr. Bale around the mill. Mrs. Bale could speak English, even though General Vallejo in Sonoma was her uncle. Of course, her husband was English before becoming Mexican. Things were heating up to boiling between us Anglos and the Mexicans. That was all the talk at the mill.
Oh, well, in early summer, our first wheat crops were beginning to ripen, and me too. Our men joined with about 30 others, all newcomers, and decided it was now or never. So off they set, overnight on a Saturday, intent on nothing less audacious than the conquest of California. And would you believe it? My labor with Molly kicked up right about the same time.
Only the Lord knows the time, sister. But we had to get moving, baby or no, if we were going to be safe. We ladies and youngins, still in the Napa Valley, packed our wagons and headed to Sonoma, though it was a journey for many hours. We hid in the brush near town until, sweet relief, our men folk came to say that General Vallejo in Sonoma was taken prisoner at Sutters. The fort was ours, no shots fired.
And I could wait no longer. As our men raised a flag with a funny-looking bear on it, my baby Molly was born. She loved the story about how she and the California Republic came to be.
And Sam won't brag, but in Aunt Cain, Molly's son, John McCormick, grew into a fine man and was elected county supervisor, and had a first-rate buggy to drive into town. Many of you here may have known his daughter, Babe Learned, and her daughter, Sandra Perry. Those two ladies gave the beautiful buggy to the Historical Society.
Well, the high school put in a play, I hear, about Oklahoma, and pulled that buggy right up on the stage.
I lived 60 years in this town and 64 years married to Jack York, till age 81. Jack joined me here in 1910. He was near 90. The Bear Flagger Hudsons and Yorks are here for many years.
We were a rough and rowdy bunch daring to take over Sonoma in 1846. I wonder if folks today consider us womenfolk veterans of the Mexican-American War, even though our men get all the credit.
Lord, we surely had our own battles and shared the risks.
Well, I expect you folks will be waiting to hear about the Mexicans and the Bear Flaggers from the men. I see 2 kinsmen who worked with our husbands, just itching to talk.
Yes, but just yonder, Mr. Calvin Griffith awaits. Calvin was a spirited 17-year-old on our wagon in 45, and after the war married my niece Lydia. I see he's with Judge James McCord.
Mr. McCord is family, too. He married Calvin's little sister, Mary, just after the war. And Lucinda's little brother, David, married Miss Frances Griffith. I came to love all the Griffith children on our long journey across the plains.
We kept them close, assimilated to neighbors, and laugh in the great hereafter. Y'all come back and visit us again. More tales to tell. Good job,
The Bear Flag men, still here in later years, applied for but did not get U.S. military pensions unless they had afterwards enlisted officially with the American forces as volunteers. And that's exactly what our spirit, Calvin Griffith, did as an 18-year-old. But most veterans of the Mexican War buried here served from their home states back east and only came to California after the war. And that's the case for our spirit, James McCord, who volunteered for the war from the state of New Jersey. Gentlemen, thank you for your hospitality and speaking with us.
You are most welcome, neighbors. I'm Calvin Chesterfield Griffith, and you are right. I was a Bear Flagger, and just about the youngest of all, age 18. Had to do my part to keep our family safe and salient in California no matter what. With no passports, our money was no good, no hope of land, nowhere to go.
Terrible.
If I had been here in 1846, I know I would have joined you bear flaggers too. Me and Calvin here go way back to 1850. I got here just after the war when statehood was new. The name is James Henry McCord. I came up back east, New Jersey, where I learned shoemaking from age 5, but when the Mexican War started, I signed right up, age 19.
You saw some action too. Mexico's not a bit like New Jersey, I wager.
So true. I fought 6 months in the war before a broken arm got me discharged, but I never went home again. I lit out for the Michigan frontier instead, where I tried making shoes for folks in St. Joe, but the spirit was calling me west. So spring of 1849, I loaded an ox cart and headed across the plains to California.
The real 49er. Did you hit it rich in the gold rush, James?
Well, no worse than you, I reckon. I did try my luck in Sacramento, but by late 49, panning was already too rough. So I took myself to Sonoma County, where I worked logging redwoods for a spell. That's where I met General Vallejo. He put me to run on his farm and taught me about growing grapes, which I continued doing all my life.
Being a bear flagger, I had history with old Vallejo, since we jailed him and all, but once war was done, there was no finer gentleman nor rancher in Sonoma, nor any prouder American. He even helped write the state's constitution.
Looking back, did you bears even think you'd survive that raid in Sonoma back in 1846?
I know it seems mad, but we had some kind of providence on us, the destiny of California to be American. We just had to hold on. Sure enough, only 3 weeks after we flew the bear over Sonoma, in rode Colonel Revere of the U.S. Navy. He was grandson of Paul Revere. The colonel carried in new flags, the stars and stripes. What a sight.
The rebellion was done, but that meant the real war was just starting. We relish your tales of the California Battalion at the Kirkpatrick Lodge for us Napa Valley veterans. Can scarcely believe you served under that hero, John C. Fremont.
Rode 9 months with him. Got a fancy medal to show for it, too. Made from Mexican cannon. Say, James, was there anyone else besides Vallejo you met in Sonoma in the early days?
Folks, my esteemed friend Calvin here knows well that 1850 Sonoma is when he and I met. But far more importantly, when I met his sister, Mary, my beautiful wife and mother of our 10 children. Calvin here was back and forth to the goldfields, but after we married in 51, Mary and I headed up to Napa Valley to settle near the Griffiths' old friends, the Hudsons and Yorks. There were a few houses up our way, but the valley was growing fast in the 50s and 60s. Before long, we purchased 93 acres along the country road.
Your farm was a beauty. Your vineyards and winery, too. Southeast corner is Infidel today, Pine Station, or, as the old-timers say, Bellow Station. No surprise you got the railroad put at a stop near your door. Such an important fellow. Just as a piece in a county judge.
My farm was my pride. In the viticulture club, we started to improve grapes. I recall making, say, 16,000 gallons of wine in 1869. Oh, and Calvin, you came back here too, from your orchards in Mark West Springs, your 83 acres. And don't forget, it was St. Helena where you courted your dear wife, Lydia, a niece of the Hudson family.
Yes, indeed. These are the ties that bind, my friend. A happy life. Oh, and I want to tell our visitors, I'm especially proud of one of my granddaughters, Miss Ivy Lober. Ivy lived till 1969, and if you know local history, you've heard her name. She spent her life keeping the old stores alive, like getting the bale mill rebuilt and getting a historical society started. She spent lots of time with her old Grandpa Griffiths before I passed in 1969, so maybe I will take some credit. She's nearby now. Just there.
Here, here. I think this calls for a toast.
To history,
To family,
to farming,
to St. Helena wine,
and to good fortune.
at least for us.
In war.
So we are with General Rutherford, who is no relation to the town of Rutherford or any other Rutherford that you may have heard of. He spent his Civil War years back east in Illinois and Washington, D.C., and Lieutenant Lohman served entirely in the West. While these two gentlemen had little in common, each played an interesting role in American history with tales to tell of their Civil War service. So, gentlemen, thank you for speaking with us.
Hello, friends. My name is John Lohman. I enlisted in the Union Army when I was a young man at 28 years. I served in the 7th Infantry, Company K, during what turned out to be the very last Tuesday War. For Californians, this terrible war was much different than the brutal, bloody war fought by the boys back east. True, General Rutherford?
Don't be so modest, Lieutenant Loman. Wars were won by the force of arms alone. What the California Military District did was essentially a Union cause. And I believe I was, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. And indeed, my work was never along the battle lines, but I believe I was critical to victory. I was a young lord before the war, a northerner from Vermont who set up a business in the deep south, Alabama of all places. That was the 1850s. I supervised construction in the latest in communication technology, telegraph lines, marvelous speed. What was your life before the war, Lieutenant Loman?
Yes. We all had different lives for the secession in 61, General. I was born in Germany, but before I was 25, I made San Francisco my home. I learned mining and worked at that all my life. Mining brought me to St. Helena too, though I never bought a house here. My sister Anna's family moved here from San Francisco in 1873. So when mining brought me to St. Helena, I lived with her on Main Street. St. Helena became my second home for over 35 years.
My family also lived on Main Street, though sadly, not long. In April of 1875, I contracted tuberculosis, and we moved to Napa Valley for the warm climate. My friend, Dr. Melvin, had a ranch in Conn Valley and recommended Napa Valley's famous health resorts to me. I saw it, but alas, and did not find the cure, and died just a year later. Though 1876 was just 5 years before the GIR post formed.
Still so young too, General. Only 47. Yet you have this unique claim to fame. Is it true that you knew Abraham Lincoln in both life and death?
It is true. I left Alabama as soon as war talk filled the air, headed to Quincy, Illinois, a small town along the Mississippi River opposite of Missouri. My brother Reuben was there, working with Abe Lincoln to get him elected president in 1860. As the war began, so began my military career. I was a quartermaster for the state of Illinois troops, a difficult job procuring and distributing all the mines, mules, munitions, food, and clothing that all our men might need. I was then sent to Washington, D.C. as one of the top quartermasters in the whole Union effort. They made me a general, too.
What a marvel to think, over here on this side of the continent, how you're at the heart of action in Washington. I joined up later in 1864. My company organized Presidio in San Francisco. I spent most of my years of service in the deserts of Arizona. The Army kept us there for another year after Appomattox as a sort of border patrol. We kept the Apache Indians at bay and let the Sonorans of Mexico know we didn't want their revolution in California. It's important work perhaps, but nothing like being in Washington and knowing Abe Lincoln himself like you, General.
Oh, it was indeed a privilege, Lieutenant Loman. For I was an eyewitness to President Lincoln's final tragedy in April of 1865. How it burns still in my heart that on such a fateful evening, just 1 week after General Lee's surrender, the foul assassin Booth not become man, but demon. The coward's bullet entered the left side of the president's head and lodged within. Such a wound would be fatal to an ordinary man. President Lincoln's iron constitution refused to yield until past dawn.
Oh my God, and you're in the very room?
The very room. As Miss Lincoln wept, General of War Stanton ordered me to do the time-honored tradition of placing coppers over the poor man's eyes. Though I was dispirited seeing those coppers, too poor, too common for such an extraordinary man. I then instead found 2 large silver $50, far more fitting. I then ordered General Aguirre to ring the bells of Washington and spread the sad news of our fallen Colossus. Me and Aguirre sat vigil by the deathbed until noon. In my orders at last, I was in 33 hours without sleep, although sleep would not come. I rose, pen to paper, and recorded all I witnessed in these past hours.
What a great gift to posterity it is, how you chronicled these woeful hours, Lincoln's last, in such detail. To think, how unknown are our past that such a man as you should rest here in St. Helena, far from Vermont, from Quincy, and from Washington, D.C.
Well, Lieutenant, nothing in my life prepared me for my humble role in President Lincoln's final tragedy in April of 1865. This town welcomed me warmly in my short time here. Such a beautiful place to rest. My only regret, perhaps, having my family and children stay in Quincy and not being able to help to save me and my Union broken arms. It is gratifying to greet new friends here today.
After the devastations of the Civil War, Congress repurposed the U.S. military to focus on domestic expansion, supporting business development like railroads, and protecting white pioneer settlement in the vast Western territories. This era plays a big role in the romantic Hollywood version of American history's good guys versus bad guys and winning the West. But historians are, it's a very difficult area and era to talk about the American Indian Wars, and it's a problematic term, and it's a very difficult history to face. as Americans, but historians are getting better at it and working to weave in Native American voices and experiences as essential to the full story. We have to be willing to see and acknowledge the violence that's far too often at the root of our historical inheritance, and that includes here in Napa Valley, which is a story for another day. Nevertheless, on this tour, seeing American history through the eyes of our veterans, we could not fail to take note of this important, highly consequential era. But we're going to move on to our next stop in 1898 and the Spanish-American War.
Pleasure to hear you talk about the challenges of our exciting times. And yes, my career in the Navy began a proud tradition in our families. There are now 3 generations of Navy sons and fathers, all bearing the name Manly Hale Simmons. I am Captain Simmons. My son here outranks me as Rear Admiral.
At ease, Pop. You're always Dr. Simmons anyway. You joined straight out of medical school, right?
I started as a surgeon in 1872. The same year General Grant was re-elected president. I retired about 40 years later, in 1911, from command of the Naval Hospital in Mare Island in Vallejo.
Important work, but sounds tamer than your action-packed career really was. You weren't always stationed ashore. Your service at sea, especially during the Spanish-American War, was legendary among me and my fellow cadets when we were on our first assignment in Cuba. Not many Navy men get to serve in the same action as their fathers.
True, son. And yes, my career was half ashore in both surgery and medical administration, but half was at sea stations all over the world. Cuba, in 1898, turned out to be particularly adventurous, especially for a man of near 50 years and a doctor to boot. After the Army had been so bloodied on July 1st at the Battle of San Juan Hill, I volunteered medical care to the wounded, but on July 3rd, I saw on the horizon the Spanish fleet advancing on Santiago Bay and firing on my ship, the USS Iowa. I had to get back.
You commandeered a newspapersman's ship and took up full steam down the Iowa. Your shipmates cheered as you climbed the swinging Jacob's ladder to climb aboard and help in that battle.
It was a turning point, the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. Victory. The Iowa even took the Spanish admiral prisoner and saved the Spanish sailors from the bay. After Cuba, the Navy sent me to Mare Island and St. Helena. Lots of folks in those days lived here and took the interurban train down to Mare Island and Vallejo to work.
I'm glad you brought the family here before your first retirement in 1911. The Rancho Manzanita farmhouse on Sulphur Springs Avenue was a showplace, and all of our families enjoyed holidays here for many years. My son Buff lived here too, though that Rear Admiral Manly Hale Simmons, your grandson, rests in Arlington National Cemetery in D.C.
Right. I love this town. The Grace Church, the New American Legion Post, School Board, Farm Bureau, and Chamber of Commerce. I even served a year as president of the Bank of St. Helena after Colonel Lyman passed. It's an American duty to help his community.
But the Navy wasn't finished with you yet, Pop. You and I were fated to serve yet again in the same conflict, this time the Great War.
That's right. I was close to 70 years when the Navy brought me back to Bear Island. I headed recruitment in San Francisco for a bit, then even got one last adventure on the sea, all the way to Guam. We surely thought that was the war to end all wars. You survived some dangerous duty yourself in those years, son.
I was 20 years into my career when the US joined the war in 1917. We needed to move troops fast over the Atlantic and get them to the fight in Europe. I captained the USS Croonland and started moving troops in 1918. She was a passenger ship pre-war converted for patriotic duties.
The war had been going on for 3 years already in Europe, and the Atlantic was a literal minefield.
Yeah, the Germans had strategically mined both open waters and ports to block our way, but the biggest threat was from the German U-boats, submarines patrolling the waters invisible to big ships like ours and armed with torpedoes. It was the German torpedoes sinking American vessels that finally made President Wilson join America into the war.
To make the world safe for democracy. That was Wilson's call to us, and we answered.
The Croonland was lucky, made 5 crossings and brought thousands of men to the front, with only one close call. Too close. We spotted a German U-boat 200 yards starboard, fired, and hit. That sinking earned me the Navy Cross.
After the war, you got to do some building, some engineering.
My years as a CV, the Navy's construction force. Whatever the mission needed, we delivered. And we now know sadly that the Great War did not end the wars. My final post came in the 1940s World War II as the commander of the 55th Naval District in Norfolk, Virginia.
I'm so proud of your service, son. The Spanish-American War, the Great War, the Navy Cross, Seabees, and finally World War II. You earned your retirement near LA.
Thanks, Dad. That means a lot coming from you. And like you, I lived a long life into my 80s. It's good to be here together in this place.
And in that old Navy tradition, fair winds and following seas, son.
Fair winds and following seas, Dad. And to you all.
The Philippines, over 7,000 islands, are on the far side of the earth from Cuba, almost 17,000 miles. The capital, Manila, on Manila Bay, and there in 1898, floated the entirety of the Spanish Empire's Pacific Fleet. On May 1st, in one of the most one-sided military upsets of all time, U.S. Admiral Deary's Asiatic Fleet attacked the Spanish and destroyed their entire fleet before noon. Zero loss of American life, not a shot fired in the city. Dewey was an instant hero. And back home, war recruitment soared. The U.S. needed infantry and cavalry to pursue a grand war in the rest of the Philippines, and within 6 weeks of Dewey's victory, 3 local young men answered that call, volunteered together in San Francisco, trained at the Presidio. First time the Presidio was used in war times. And then by July 1898, George Kunta Lake, Robert Ritchie, and George Grant are outfitted, trained in artillery, and steamed toward Hawaii, en route to artillery duty in Manila. They'd be over 7,000 miles from home.
We're also meeting George Kudalong's younger sister, Leonie, a veteran of the Great War, also known as World War I.
I became a butcher like our father, and then moved to San Francisco. I worked in the meat market and the stockyards.
The Spanish-American War started April 1898. So the U.S. Navy reached the Philippines.
Yes, my buddies and I decided to enlist. We left for the Philippines in the summer of 1898.
Well, we're very glad you returned alive. But your house was ruined. Tell me about it.
I was there for 15 months, but I lost about 100 pounds. I was only age 32.
You were never the same.
I spent the rest of my life in and out of veterans hospitals. I've been to Los Angeles, Yountville, and similar institutions.
And on June 14th, 1920, we lost you at Army Camp in South Dakota following an operation.
My funeral was held there with full military honors, followed by funeral at the military cemetery in South Dakota.
Well, as you know, I trained to be a nurse and spent my life in that career.
You are far too modest. You enlisted as a Red Cross nurse in 1918.
I served in World War I, but my duty was mostly the Army's camp. 3 months near Palo Alto, and only since about 2 years to train troops to go into combat.
And you were recognized by that service by receiving a cross on the service flag at the St. Helena Catholic Church.
So many other girls in our family went on to be nurses. No doubt given our patriotic service.
Yes, our sister Lucy's daughter, who was named Leonie after you, became a nurse.
And our niece Ellen became a nurse. She was the daughter of our sister Frances, who married James Odell. Well, we all know where they lived here in town. James is buried in our family plot too.
One immigrant family from France to Ireland to St. Helena had rich participation in the military of their new country.
Our next spirits each lived many decades in St. Helena, but not at the same time. St. Helena-born Mrs. Bertha Schweinitzer Blum has traveled here today from next door at Holy Cross Cemetery, where she has rested since 1937. Bertha was eager to come to meet career Navy man, a famous Olympics 11-time medalist in sharpshooting, Captain Carl Townsend Osborne. Why was she so curious? Well, they are connected by a place an old home and garden on Spring Street. Just after her death, Bertha's grieving husband, Robert, who had the Ford dealership in town, sold Captain Osborne the big farmhouse, barn, and grounds that Bertha's carpenter-turned-winemaker father, Anton, had built in the 1870s. And the 5-acre place had been in her family almost 50 years. Captain Osborne, a just retiring bachelor, lived there, beautifying the property for nearly 3 decades, the rest of his life, and even found love and married here in St. Helena. The Holzhauers lived there in this same home in the 1970s and 80s when it passed in 1991 to its current owner. Let's meet Bertha now and listen as she learns more about Captain Osborne and his lifelong career in the Navy. The Wilpers died.
We had no idea we had sold our house to a famous Olympian. Oh, that. I was on the U.S. Summer Olympic shooting team 3 times. I won 11 medals in rifle shooting competition.
You're too modest. You had more medals than any American for a long time.
In 1994, I was inducted into the Shooting Hall of Fame. I was buried here by that time, so I did not attend.
You did more than win Olympic medals.
Well, that's true. I graduated from the Navy Academy. My ship was part of the Great White Fleet. We circled the globe by order of President Roosevelt.
And you were captain of the Presidential Yacht Mayflower? Tell me about that.
Wilson was president at the time. Many prominent people cruised on my ship. Wilson even courted his bride on board.
What other ships were you in charge of?
The USS Henderson carried troops to China. The USS Dallas cruised along the East Coast and the Caribbean.
How'd you end up in St. Helena?
I visited St. Helena with my friend El Carpi. It was so nice here, I decided to spend the rest of my life here.
Our family came from Austria and bought the land in 1873, but it was time to sell and move on.
I bought your property in 1939, but had to go to San Francisco for active duty for World War II.
Did you have a wife when you came here?
No, I never married until I met Mary Douglas. We got married in 1947 when I was 63 and she was 43.
The bachelor sea captain got married at 63 to a young sweetheart?
Yes, we lived in your family home on Spring Street. We loved tending our flowers, fruits, and vegetable garden.
My siblings and I were so glad you took such good care of what we built.
Mary organized a party for my 80th birthday. Many of my Navy friends attended, and we had our last reunion.
The beautiful house and gardens that we shared still lay there today at 1817 Spring Street.
Easy. It is hard for us today to imagine that 1940s world when all was under threat and just about every citizen in the U.S. pitched in their best for the war effort. Even for civilians, there were scrap metal drives, savings bonds to purchase, victory gardens to plant. In this patriotic do-or-die atmosphere, Louis Barberi, the 27-year-old son of an Italian immigrant saloon keeper in town, stepped up to serve. Louis was not one for schooling. He'd helped his father in the corner saloon at Main and Hunt. But in the Army, Louis got trained as a field medic. And after barely surviving a terrible wound in the jungles of Burma, Louis returned home. Vera Sievers also stepped up in 1942, and she was born in Charles Valley, the granddaughter of a German immigrant wine grower, Frank Sievers. By the early 1900s, phylloxera and prohibition had forever altered the wine business, so farming was not for Vera's destiny. By the time she enlisted in 1942, Vera was 38 and with a college degree and had worked both as a statistician and as a teacher. In the military, she became an officer in the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, called the WACS, and was assigned to the European theater in military intelligence. She spent a decade in the post-war Army headquarters in Heidelberg, Germany, in the Inspector General's office, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. We brought together these two local vets, whose military lives took such different paths, might give us an interesting and wider glimpse into the lives of St. Helena's during and after World War II.
Well, Lieutenant Colonel Sievers, it is a shared honor to be resting you and speaking with you today.
We're both locals. I was born in Charles Valley in 1904.
But you are much older than me and better educated than me. I am a small-town son of immigrants.
I was an ambitious country girl. I graduated from college and became a teacher in San Francisco.
My dad owned a saloon on Main Street, where I worked tending bar.
I applied for officer training in the Army in 1942 at age 37.
Just like me. I joined the Army in 1942. I had a wife and a child. They sent me to medical training.
It was WAC to me, Women's Army Corps. Army Intelligence in Germany was my assignment.
The Army sent me to Arkansas in 1942 for medical training, then to Oregon.
Then you went overseas?
I was with the 1,963rd Service Command Unit, then sent to Burma, which is now called Myanmar.
What was your role there?
As a medic, I saw some of the worst jungle fighting of World War II. In May 1944, I was shot in the neck and chest. I was in the hospital for 7 months.
In 1954, I returned to Washington, D.C. to work for Army Intelligence. I was the first WAC officer in that unit, having achieved lieutenant colonel rank.
I got married again in 1952 to Helena when I was 37 and she was 34. We got married on a live radio broadcast.
In 1957, I retired from the Army and lived with my sister Lomita on Zinfandel Lane.
Helena and I lived on Tainted. I volunteered for the American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars, for both I was commander.
Wars could not have been fought without medics like you.
My family started with nothing, but this country gave us an opportunity. God bless America.
So thank you so much for coming today and supporting our local drama department, and thank you to the Historical Society. This is actually our 10th collaboration, so it's very exciting. So thank you, Mariam. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.